The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the cost. And while this Prime Minister wants to drive up the cost of literally everything, common sense Conservatives are focused on axing the tax, building the homes, fixing the budget, and stopping the crime. Today we're going to focus on that first piece of it, because on April 1st, the Prime Minister has a cruel April Fool's Day joke planned for Canadians. As if prices weren't high enough already, this out-of-touch Prime Minister is going to raise the carbon tax by a staggering 23% in just a couple of weeks. Now, I know I speak on behalf of all my Conservative colleagues when I say that we sympathize with the struggles that hardworking Canadians are going through. We've seen it. We've seen it in our ridings, Mr. Speaker. I've been in grocery stores where people who are well-dressed, people who look like they have jobs and means, go through the meat aisle, pick up a package of beef, stare at it agonizingly, and then put it back when they realize they just can't afford it. That's what life is like after 8 years of this Liberal government. And what's happening on April 1st? Those prices are going to go up yet again. So common sense Conservatives are fighting all week to spike the hike, to convince the Prime Minister and his NDP coalition partners to at the very least not raise it any more. The first thing you can do to help Canadians is to hold the line on this punitive tax and not make it any worse. I want to deal with a few myth-busting of the carbon tax. Remember when the Prime Minister promised that the carbon tax would do a few things? First of all, he said it would be revenue neutral. Then he said that it would help Canada reach its greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. And he said that Canadians would be better off with it because of a rebate scheme that he had developed. At this point, I'll just remind the House that I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member for Stormont, Dundas and South Glengarry. So those 3 points, those are the 3 pillars that he built his carbon tax on. Revenue neutral, reduce emissions and help Canada reach its targets, and that he would give out more than he would take into Canadians. Let's bust all 3 of those myths. First of all, it's not revenue neutral. The government keeps a sizable percentage of the carbon tax. In fact, the CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, estimates that the carbon tax alone costs small businesses $2.5 billion. That's $2.5 billion right out of the economy, sucked right out. And those costs that those businesses have to pay, all that gets passed on to consumers. The government keeps far more they collect than they give out with the carbon tax. That myth completely busted. That pillar has been completely demolished. Emissions reductions. Well, let's take a look at what experts say about this Liberal government's plan. It hasn't helped them hit a single emissions target. The Climate Change Performance Index ranks Canada 62 out of 67 spots. Canada's actually fallen several spots on that ranking under this Liberal government after 8 years of this Prime Minister. Canada now ranks behind countries like Kazakhstan and Algeria and Belarus. Those countries are doing better than Canada under this government. The Environment Commissioner said that this government was stacking, quote, failures on top of failures. That's the Environment Commissioner that this Prime Minister appointed. His own environment watchdog has concluded that this government is stacking failure after failure. So it's clearly not an environment plan, Mr. Speaker. It is a tax plan. And let's take a look at the impacts it has on families. The third myth, that somehow Canadians would be better off if they paid this tax. That has been completely shattered. We know that it adds to the cost of fuel, heating, and groceries. So let's take a look at some specifics. Starting April 1st, the carbon tax will add 17 cents to every litre of gasoline, 21 cents to every litre of diesel, we're looking at staggering costs that Canadians just cannot afford. The food experts, the people who monitor the grocery industry and the price of groceries on the aisle are saying that Canadians are going to have to pay an extra $700 this year on grocery prices before the carbon tax hike is even factored in. When you factor in all of the secondary costs, and see, this is the ridiculous rebate ruse that the Liberals are trying to sell Canadians. They're trying to sell Canadians that somehow magically, if you pay these higher taxes, these higher carbon tax costs, and the government takes the money and swooshes it around in Ottawa and spits it back out in various parts at various times, that somehow Canadians will be better off. The only problem is that once you take a look at the scheme, it falls apart almost instantly. Because what the Liberals did was something that was very tricky, very, very tricky, very clever, but very tricky. They designed the carbon tax rebate to only capture the direct cost. So only when you see the carbon tax on a bill, whether it's filling up your car with gas or paying your home heating bill, and you see that line item cost, that's the only thing that the rebate scheme factors in. What it doesn't factor in is how all those costs in the economy get passed on to consumers. And we pay that higher carbon tax every time we buy something that had to be grown or manufactured or had to be transported or had to be cooled or refrigerated or warmed or heated. Anytime a retailer has to pay the carbon tax on their heating bill, on their utility bills, all of that gets cascaded on, and consumers and Canadians pay for that. The rebate scheme captures absolutely none of that. But don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. I know many Canadians might say, okay, well, the Liberals have a tale to tell, and the Conservatives have their perspective. Let's look at what independent experts say about this part of the carbon tax plan. The Prime Minister's own budget watchdog, the independent, nonpartisan parliamentary budget officer, did this analysis, went through all the numbers, and he broke Canadian families into various groups. He calls them quintiles. So basically you take all Canadian wage earners and you divide them up into different groups based on their income levels. So based on income earners, the middle group, so these are middle-class Canadians, these are average middle-income earners. In Alberta, $1,400 worse off. In Saskatchewan, $929 worse off. This is once the carbon tax is fully implemented. Manitoba, $1,000 worse off. Ontario, $1,200 worse off. Nova Scotia, $1,100 worse off. Prince Edward Islanders, Mr. Speaker, another $1,100 worse off. And for the people in Newfoundland and Labrador, $680 worse off, even after the rebate scheme. So we're talking about average middle-class Canadians. If we go one group lower, look at the income bracket, just one group below that, they're still worse off too. They're not better off. These families are still paying more in the rebate, but that middle group is significant. That's almost $100 a month. That Canadian families just simply cannot afford. They can't afford groceries, they can't afford to keep the heat on, and they cannot afford to pay higher costs through the carbon tax. And again, Mr. Speaker, these are the independent analyses of the Prime Minister's own budget watchdog. And the final point I'll make, Mr. Speaker, because I see you're telling me I'm running out of time, is the role the carbon tax plays in inflation. The government tries to say that the carbon tax is not a significant driver of inflation. Let's look at what the Bank of Canada governor himself said. I'm just going to quote very briefly from committee, and then I'll yield the floor, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, told committee that eliminating the carbon tax would drop inflation by 0.6 percentage points. And my colleague from Northumberland asked him to clarify, because 0.6% might not sound like a lot. But when inflation is at 3.8, target is 2, and the Bank of Canada can start cutting interest rates once inflation gets closer to target. What that means is that 0.6% is about a third of the 1.8% that Canada has to eliminate in inflation to get back down to target so interest rates can come down. So in other words, the carbon tax is responsible for about a third of the extra inflation that's plaguing Canadians and forcing the Bank of Canada to keep interest rates high. If the government eliminated the carbon tax, they would be 1/3 of the way to getting inflation back down to target, which means interest rates and prices can come down. So this week, Mr. Speaker, Conservatives are going to stand with the 70% of Canadians who oppose this carbon tax hike, the 70% of premiers who oppose the carbon tax hike, and we're going to fight to spike the hike so we can axe the tax. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Question.